Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about sentence structure and phrases and clauses. Let's start with the basic building blocks of an English sentence. You have words, and by that I mean you need to understand and know your parts of speech. I will assume that knowledge today. Then you have phrases, which are built out of putting individual words together. You put your phrases together and you get clauses, and you can either have a main clause or a subordinate clause. And a clause may stand by itself as a sentence, a simple sentence that is, but by joining different types of clauses you can get more complicated types of sentences. In other words, you get your compound sentences if you're joining main clauses together, and complex sentences if you're joining main clauses with subordinate clauses. I'm not going to talk about the parts of speech today. As I said, I'm going to assume that knowledge. But let's move on and have a look at the different constituents of the sentence. And the first thing I want to actually look at, we're going to skip the parts of speech, as I said, but we're going to have a look at phrases. Now, our phrases perform various functions within a sentence, but you need to actually know the different types of phrases. You have noun phrases, verb phrases, adjectival phrases, prepositional phrases, and adverbial phrases. And each one of those things has a different function to play in an English sentence. It's important to be able to have a look at these different things and identify them and know what you're talking about. Now, by putting different phrases together, you're able to form a clause. But as I've already mentioned, each phrase has a specific function in a clause, in a sentence. And so here I've got a diagram of a basic sentence, or basic clause rather. This is the structure of a basic clause or a simple sentence. And it goes like this. The things that you have to have that are compulsory is that you need to have a subject and a verb. Now, a subject is just about always going to be, or a subject is going to be your noun group. Your verb will be a verb group or a verb phrase. Your subject will be a noun phrase. Your verb will be a verb phrase. You put those two things together and you've already got the foundation of a sentence. Your very, very simple sentence or simple clause can be something simple like, I slept. That's a full sentence. But if that's the only type of sentence that you ever write, well, then your writing is going to be particularly dull, and it's going to be very difficult to express anything other than the most basic ideas. And so what you have is you have a whole bunch of other stuff that is optional, but that is necessary for good communication. And you'll see that those things fall in the second bracket here. So you have your subject, you have your verb, and then you move on to other things. You can either have an object or a complement in the rest of your sentence. Your object is always another noun group, and then you can have a complement, which is an adjective group, an adjectival phrase. Another thing we can add on to either one of those two things is what we call an adverbial. And an adverbial in terms of sentence structure is either an adverbial phrase or a prepositional phrase. And so what you end up having is your sentence is looking something like this. You have your subject and your predicate, which is everything else. Your subject is obviously your subject. It's going to be a noun phrase. Your predicate has to have a verb phrase in it, and that can take on a variety of different forms. And then you can have either an object or a complement, depending on what you're talking about, and you can have an adverbial if you want. Now, obviously, you don't have to have all of those things at once. In fact, you can only have an object or a complement together in one clause, but you could have one of those two things, an adverbial plus a verb plus a subject. And then you put those things together, you have a clause. You have a simple sentence. Now, you can join other clauses to that to make a more complicated sentence, and as I've mentioned before. And let's have a look at some examples of sentences. As I said, the most basic form of sentence you can have is something simple like George failed. Subject plus verb. George is your subject, that is your noun phrase, even though it's one word. A phrase can be one word. George is your subject, failed is your verb phrase, your verb group, again just one word, and so you've got a 2-word sentence, George failed. But that tends to, when you read that tends to raise other questions. Well, what did he fail? Well, George failed the test. It's the second example. Here you've got an example of a slightly more complicated sentence. You have a subject, George, you have failed, the verb, the test is your object. The test is also a noun group, which tells us that it is the object. It tells us what George failed, provides us with that extra information. Now you can make the sentence a bit more complicated by saying George failed the test miserably, and so you use an adverbial. And the adverbial tells us how he failed the test. Was it close? No, it wasn't. He did terribly. He failed miserably. So there you have a slightly more complicated sentence. Let's move on to another example where we have a complement. George was disappointed. George is our subject. It's the noun phrase. Was is your linking verb, is your verb, the verb phrase. Disappointed is an adjective and forms your adjectival phrase and therefore acts as the complement here. You can go one step further and say George was disappointed with the result. In this case, you have George, the subject, was your verb, disappointed, the complement, the adjective, and with the result is a prepositional phrase, which it functions as your adverbial here. And this is how you can build up your sentences to make them more complicated. You can add extra information, you can omit information, it depends what you want to do. But those are, here we've just seen 5 simple examples of fairly straightforward sentences. Very often when we write, we have far more complicated sentences, but you need to get your head around the basic sentence structure before you can start adding more and more clauses to your main clause to make things more interesting. Let's have a look at something that's perhaps more indicative of how people write. And it's this: George was disappointed with the result, but he didn't study, so he couldn't complain much. So here we've got a far more complicated sentence where we have 3 clauses joined together with conjunctions. So if we were to break the sentence down and pull it apart and analyze it a bit, the first thing we'd have to do is actually identify what are our clauses here. Remember, a clause has to have a subject, has to have a verb. So if we have a look at the sentence with the sentence here, you can split it up according to the conjunctions. That's actually a tip. The easiest way to see that you're moving on from one clause to another is when you've got a conjunction. But you've got to be careful because you can use conjunctions within a clause, within a phrase. For example, if you were to say something like, tonight I'm going to eat fish and chips for supper, the and between fish and chips doesn't indicate the separation of 2 clauses. That's actually just that joins 2 constituents of a meal together. So you do have to be careful about following that tip, but generally speaking, if you want to easily split up your clauses, look for the conjunctions. That's the first thing that can help you identify the different clauses in a sentence. The next thing you have to make sure is that there's a subject and a verb in each one. So let's have a look at this one. George was disappointed with the result, but he didn't. Okay, so there is a conjunction but, and you can see we have George, subject, was, verb, disappointed with the result, but he didn't study. He is your subject as a subject here. Your pronoun acts as a noun phrase, and didn't study is our verb. So we have another separate clause here. So the first one, George was disappointed. We've already done that particular sentence, which is a subject verb complement with the result, adverbial. He didn't study is your subject and a verb. Didn't study is your verb here, but it's expressed in the negative, hence the not. So you just have a subject and a verb here. So is another conjunction. He couldn't complain much. Again, you've got your verb explained in you've got your verb expressed in the negative. He is your subject. Couldn't complain is your verb. Much is your adverbial because it gives us it provides extra information about that particular verb. In this case, it shows that he couldn't really complain. That there wasn't much complaining to be done because he didn't study. And so here you have a single unified sentence that is a lot more complicated than just the initial examples we were looking at, because you have multiple clauses together. Now, you wouldn't really want to go too much further beyond this in terms of complexity, because then you start it becomes easy to start losing control of your sentences. So you do want to be careful. One downfall of a common downfall that people have when they write sentences is they tend to join main clauses together with the coordinating conjunction and. And if you do this more than once, you start to end up with quite childish sentences, and it's actually stylistically bad. You might be able to create sentences that are grammatically correct, but then you move on to another problem, which is where your style is bad. So you do need to be careful how you go about structuring your sentences. And while I'm talking about style here, one should also consider the need to have long sentences mixed with short sentences and with some in between. You do want to have a variety of sentences rather than just a whole series of extremely long sentences. That's difficult to read, and one of the things you're trying to do when you write is to communicate. If you want to communicate clearly, you need to make it easy to read, and so you want a nice variety of types of sentences, some simple, some complex. And so on. Okay, but let's come back to talking about actual sentence structure. I've already mentioned your basic sentence structure is subject, verb, object or complement, and then adverbial. For those of you who have studied another language, Afrikaans for example, you will know that they use stompie there to help you structure your sentences. Well, in English, there's something similar. Your basic structure is this: subject, verb, object or complement, and adverbial. And if you're wanting to create more complicated sentences than just a straight clause, well, then you're going to have your main clause, a conjunction, and then a subordinate clause. Or you can have a main clause if you want a compound sentence. You can also play around with that sentence structure a little bit and switch around the clauses and have the conjunction and the subordinate clause first, followed by a comma, and then a main clause after that. By doing this from time to time, you do vary the structure of your sentences, which again makes your writing more effective. You do need to be careful about it though, in a way how you're going to do this. For example, there are certain conjunctions you don't want to start sentences with, so and, for example. But I will show some examples now as to how one can write this sort of sentence. Another variant that you can have in your sentence structure is to start off with a discourse marker. A discourse marker is something like firstly, or secondly. And the best way to write that sort of sentence is to start with your discourse marker, followed by a comma as a general rule, and then follow it with the main clause, conjunction, main clause or subordinate clause, whatever the case might be. So let's have a look some examples of this, of compound and complex sentences. The standard way of expressing the following idea would be this: the cricket match was cancelled because it was raining. There you have your main clause, the cricket match was cancelled, and you have your subordinate clause, because it was raining. You have main clause followed by subordinate clause. However, there is another way of writing this sentence. Because it was raining, the cricket match was cancelled. Now, you might have been told that you can never start a sentence with because. You can, but you can only start a sentence with because if that because is part of a subordinate clause, it has a comma after it, and then you have the main clause following that. So that's how you can jiggle up or rejig the order of your sentences, of your complex sentences at least. And there are a variety of reasons for doing that. It depends really what you want to draw attention to and so on. If you want to create a compound sentence, then obviously you're going to be using coordinating conjunctions. I wanted to cook dinner, but the power was out, so I couldn't do it. Each one of those things can stand by itself as a main clause, as its own simple sentence, but put them together and you get a connected thought, which is really what you want. Remember, at its core, a sentence is the expression of a single idea, a single thought. And that's what you've got to go for when you're writing a sentence. If you do not have a single coherent idea or thought expressed in your sentence, there's probably something wrong with your sentence as well. Now, that doesn't mean that your sentence tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the overall idea that you're trying to express. That's what paragraphs are for. But each sentence does have to express a coherent thought or a coherent idea. So in this case, I wanted to cook dinner, but the power was out, so I couldn't do it. You have your clauses joined together with coordinating conjunctions. Now, there are only 7 coordinating conjunctions that you need to know of at this stage, and I'm going to assume that you know which they are. I'm not going to go into that. If you do need to find out about that, well, you're welcome to go and search for it elsewhere, and it'll be fairly simple for you just to Google it and find it out. At this point, I just want to recap a little bit. You have your sentences are made up of clauses. Clauses are made up of phrases. Phrases are made up of individual words that fit together in particular ways. That's how you put together a sentence, by ordering those constituents in the correct way. Your basic sentence structure in English is subject, verb, object or complement, and adverbial. And that would then form your basic clause. You can join multiple clauses together to form more complicated sentences. I will say that there are exceptions to this. You can play around with the order of the constituents in your sentence. In other words, you can play around with the ordering of phrases. In other words, you can play around with the order of clauses, but you can also play around with the order of phrases. You just need to make sure that you're not splitting your phrases in half and that you are putting them in a position where they can actually function. If your writing is not good and you struggle with sentence structure, the best thing to do is to keep it easy and keep it simple and straightforward initially until you get into the good habit of writing your absolute basic, straightforwardly ordered sentences and clauses. Once you have done that, then you can move on to more complicated sentences that are where you play around with the order of the constituents of your sentences, where you move around your phrases. For example, moving your adverbial to the beginning of the sentence and so on. You can do those things, but you need to know what you're doing, and very often you need to punctuate it correctly. And there are various rules that arise from that I'm not going to get into today. Having said all that, having talked about phrases, clauses, and sentence structure basically, let us look at some common errors. So one of the most common errors that you find is the comma splice error. The comma splice error is the error where 2 main clauses are joined incorrectly by placing a comma between these 2 main clauses. Now remember, if you have 2 main clauses, these are things that can actually stand by themselves as complete sentences, but they can be joined together if the ideas are similar. And if you do that, you need to join them together with a coordinating conjunction. If you just tack them together and separate them with a comma, that is the comma splice error. You either need to separate them into their own sentences or you need to join them with a conjunction. Another very common error is what I call the run-on sentence, and that's when you have main clauses not joined correctly, or just clauses not joined correctly. You omit conjunctions, your sentence ends but you don't punctuate it and you just run off into another sentence, and so on. So An example that I have here is there could be a number of solutions to this problem. You could supply the community with generators and water until the problems are solved. This is a very easy one to spot. You have one sentence ending and then simply just without punctuation or conjunctions, just running off into the next one. So there's a complete sentence with there could be a number of solutions to this problem, full stop. Then you start your next sentence, you could supply the community with generators and water until the problems are solved. But the point is this, the sentence ended and then just carried on running into the next, the start of the next sentence without actually ending it. And while you might be able to understand what is going on here, if you have a lot of this, it becomes very difficult to read quickly, and it becomes quite difficult to follow the meaning of the sentence. And in some cases, the language becomes utterly unintelligible, and you cannot understand it at all. So this is a very common error. Another common error is writing in sentence fragments. These are just incomplete sentences. One good example is this, running through the forest. Well, this is not a complete sentence. You have no subject, and you do not have a finite verb here. It's not a finite verb because running is actually a participle. Participles require an auxiliary verb to be joined together with it to create a finite verb. So what you would want instead is you'd want a sentence like, the boy ran through the forest. In that case, you now have a subject, the boy, we know who actually did it, and we have changed the participle for just the past simple tense, ran. The boy ran through the forest. This is a complete sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb. The previous one does not. You could change you could change that sentence completely as well. Running through the forest is my favorite pastime, for example. In that case, running through the forest actually acts as your subject in that sentence. That's an activity, and that becomes your subject. Becomes your verb. It's the linking verb, to be again, and you carry on from there. So those are some of the common errors that you have. Another common error is just ordering the constituents in a way that just doesn't fit, that cannot function. And there are so many of these ones that I'm not going to go into them, but you can do all sorts of things that are wrong. You can split up your constituents with other constituents and so on, and you don't want to do that. Before I end, let's talk about some tips that will hopefully improve your sentence structure or your sentence construction. The first thing is this: read. Don't just read anything. A lot of people say it doesn't really matter what you read as long as you read. That's like saying it doesn't really matter what you eat as long as you eat. If you eat garbage, you get garbage results. If you read garbage, you get garbage results in your sentence structure. You need to read decent literature. That doesn't mean that you have to go and just read high literature the whole time, but you need to read books and magazine articles and newspaper articles that are actually written properly, that are written by people who know how to construct a sentence correctly and do so. The reason that reading helps is because you can subconsciously take on those things, take on the structure of a normal English sentence. However, if you read and you consciously take note of the sentence structure that you see, then you're going to get far better results. So you actually want to, when you're reading, you actually want to spend time, not every time you read, but sometimes you want to spend time thinking about how the writer has actually gone about and written his sentence and what goes where, and maybe you can think about why he's done this particular thing or that particular thing. So reading helps. Reading always helps when it comes to that, as long as you're reading stuff that is written properly. Again, if you're reading something that is just chock full of slang, it doesn't help. The other thing that can help you, this is something that people don't like doing, but when you type a WhatsApp message or you use social media, whatever it is that you spend a lot of time communicating with friends with, write in full sentences. Practice writing in full sentences. You probably spend far more time typing out WhatsApp messages to people or writing on social media than you do practicing grammar. In fact, some people never practice grammar. So what you want to do is actually give yourself practice by making it part of your normal routine, your normal communication with people. Another thing you can do is to make a conscious effort to write differently to the way that you speak. Spoken grammar is different to written grammar. And I know people sometimes suggest that you must just write it down as you would speak it. That's bad advice, because our spoken grammar is a different grammar to our written grammar. And if you do that, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to find that you make the mistakes of running on sentences to each other. That's a big mistake that people make. If you just listen to the way that I'm talking right now, it's not obvious where one sentence ends and another begins. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And if you write in the way that you speak, it's going to be informal, and you're going to be far more likely to subconsciously sip in slang and things like that are not acceptable in more formal writing. But the other thing that happens is that errors of spoken grammar creep up in your written work. So you want to consciously think about it, and then you want to actually go back and edit it and read what you've written. For somebody who's at school, if you want to improve your grammar, one of the best things to do is to actively go back and make corrections and correct the mistakes that you've made in essays and so on. If your English teacher identifies a sentence structure error, it's not so that you can feel bad about yourself, it's so that you can actually know that this is where I made a mistake and I need to fix it. Then you go and try and fix it. So those are some things that you can use to help you study or help you improve your sentence structure on a practical level. And then obviously if you don't know the grammar, well then it's going to be very difficult for you to fix the mistakes that you're making. You need to actually know the basics. You don't need to have an in-depth knowledge of English grammar, but you do need to know the basics. You need to know what a phrase is, what the parts of speech are. You need to know what a clause is, how a clause is formed, how clauses fit together. If you know those things, well, then you can analyze your own sentences, and you can write far more effective sentences and ones that are grammatically correct at that. So that's it. That's today's session on sentence structure. Perhaps not the most exciting topic in the world, but I think it is one that is useful for a lot of people. If you do have any questions, feel free to get hold of me. I'm happy to chat to you about any questions that you may have.